1984 is, I believe, a quite terrifying masterpiece. So terrifying, in fact, I don't think I should like to read another like it.
I am not absolutely dissatisfied with it. I think it is a good idea, but the execution would have been better if I had not been under the influence of TB when I wrote it.
You once claimed that you have an ability to face unpleasant facts. Is that what you've demonstrated in 1984 by drawing an accurate portrait of the future?
I think that allowing for the book being, after all, a parody, something like 1984 could actually happen. This is the direction the world is going in at the present time. In our world, there will be no emotions except fear, rage, triumph and self-abasement. The sex instinct will be eradicated. We shall abolish the orgasm. There will be no loyalty except loyalty to the party. But always there will be the intoxication of power. Always, at every moment, there will be the thrill of victory, the sensation of trampling on an enemy who is helpless. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. The moral to be drawn from this dangerous nightmare situation is a simple one. Don't let it happen. It depends on you.
In the sterile quiet of a London hospital room, in the first month of a new decade that he had already defined and darkened, one of the 20th century's most formidable consciences lay dying. It was January 21st, 1950, and Eric Arthur Blair, the man the world knew as George Orwell, was succumbing to the tuberculosis that had stalked him through poverty, war, and literary triumph. He was just 46 years old. There is a profound and terrible irony in his final moments. The man who had imagined a world of total surveillance where every whisper was heard and every thought monitored by an omnipresent Big Brother died alone. A hemorrhage in the night, a sudden final flood, and the voice that had spoken truth to power with such relentless clarity was silenced. His death, like his life, was a study in contradictions. The Eton-educated colonial policeman who embraced poverty as a penance, the socialist who became communism's most devastating critic, the patriot who dedicated his life to exposing the lies his country told itself. To understand the man who gave us Newspeak, the Thought Police, and the chilling prophecy of 1984, one must first understand the boy who was born into the suffocating embrace of the British Empire, the lonely schoolboy who learned the brutal lessons of class and power, and the reluctant imperialist who embarked on a lifelong quest for truth in a world that seemed increasingly determined to destroy it. This is the story of how Eric Blair died so that George Orwell could live, a journey into the heart of the man who became the conscience of his generation. Eric Arthur Blair was born into the twilight of an empire, a child of the very system he would later dedicate his life to dismantling. He entered the world on June 25, 1903, in Motihari, a small town in the Champaran district of Bengal, India, a place that existed for the sole purpose of administering the British Raj. His father, Richard Walmsley Blair, was a sub-deputy opium agent in the Indian Civil Service, a seemingly grand title for a man who was, in reality, a minor cog in the vast, impersonal machinery of colonial rule. The opium department itself was a morally dubious enterprise, responsible for producing and exporting opium to China, a trade that had been a source of conflict and addiction for decades. This morally compromised inheritance, this sense of being born into a system that was both powerful and corrupt, would haunt Orwell for the rest of his life. His mother, Ida Mabel Blair, née Limousin, was a woman of more complex and cosmopolitan origins. Born in Burma, she was the daughter of a French teak merchant and shipbuilder. a man whose own fortunes had risen and fallen with the unpredictable currents of colonial commerce. Ida was a more vibrant and intellectually curious figure than her husband, a woman who read widely and took an interest in the progressive ideas of the time. She was, in many ways, the source of her son's literary and intellectual inclinations, a quiet but persistent influence in a world that was otherwise dominated by the rigid codes of the British colonial class. The Blairs were, in Orwell's own devastatingly precise phrase, landless gentry, a family with the social pretensions of the upper class but without the income to support them. They were part of a vast tribe of Anglo-Indians who occupied a precarious and often anxious position in the social hierarchy of the empire. They were the rulers, but they were also the servants of a system that demanded their absolute loyalty and offered them little in the way of financial security. They were suspended in the amber of impoverished snobbery, a condition that would instill in their son a lifelong, almost pathological sensitivity to the nuances of class, money, and power. This was the world into which Eric Blair was born, a world of sahibs and servants, of formal dinners and unspoken rules, of a rigid social hierarchy that was both absurd and brutally effective. It was a world where whiteness conferred an almost magical status, a world built on the fiction of racial superiority and the reality of economic exploitation. But Eric's immersion in this world was brief. In 1904, when he was just a year old, Ida Blair, following the custom of the time, returned to England with her children, Eric and his older sister Marjorie. A younger sister, Avril, would be born later. Richard Blair remained at his post in India, a distant, almost mythical figure in his son's early life. This paternal absence, this sense of a father who was more a concept than a presence, would have a profound and lasting impact on the boy's psychological development, contributing to a sense of emotional detachment and a lifelong search for authority figures to both admire and defy. England, for the young Eric Blair, was Henley-on-Thames, a prosperous, quintessentially English town that could not have been more different from the heat and dust of Bengal. Here, in the heart of the Thames Valley, the Blairs lived a life of genteel poverty, constant struggle to maintain the appearances of their class on an inadequate income. It was a world of whispered anxieties about money, of careful calculations and social slights. A world where the wrong accent or an ill-fitting suit could be a source of profound humiliation. For a sensitive and observant child like Eric, it was an early and brutal education in the English class system, a lesson that would inform every word he ever wrote. The family lived in a series of rented houses, each one a testament to their declining fortunes and rising aspirations. Ida Blair was determined that her children should receive the best education possible, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. She was a woman of fierce ambition and quiet desperation, a woman who understood that education was the only ladder that could lift her children out of the genteel poverty into which they had been born. Eric was a precocious child, a boy who learned to read early and showed an unusual interest in words and their meanings. He was also a lonely child, a boy who found more companionship in books than in people, a boy who was already beginning to feel like an outsider in his own country. In 1911, at the tender age of 8, Eric was sent to St. Cyprian's, a preparatory boarding school on the Sussex coast. It was a traumatic and formative experience that would scar him for life and provide the material for one of his most powerful and bitter essays. Such were the joys. At St. Cyprian's, the lessons of class and power that he had absorbed unconsciously at home were taught with systematic and deliberate cruelty. He was, as he later wrote, a boy from the lower upper middle class, a scholarship student among the sons of the wealthy and the powerful. His poverty was a constant source of shame, a mark of his otherness that set him apart from his more privileged classmates. The school was run by Mr. and Mrs. Vaughan Wilkes, whom Orwell would later satirize as Sambo and Flip. They ruled the school with a mixture of snobbery, sadism, and commercial calculation. They understood, with the unerring instinct of their class, that the purpose of an institution like St. Cyprian's was not to educate but to mould, to produce a certain type of English gentleman who could take his place in the ruling elite of the empire. For a boy like Eric, who was too intelligent to be easily moulded and too poor to be fully accepted, the experience was a form of psychological torture. He was distinguished by his intellectual brilliance, but this too was a source of anxiety, a gift that he was expected to use to bring glory to the school and justify his place within it. He learned to lie, to dissemble, to hide his true feelings behind a mask of conformity. He became, in his own words, a morose, withdrawn, eccentric boy, a lonely and unhappy child who found solace only in books and in the private world of his own imagination. The beatings were frequent and arbitrary. The food was poor, and the atmosphere was one of constant fear and anxiety. But St. Cyprian's was not just a place of suffering, it was also a place of education. It was here that Eric Blair first encountered the brutal realities of power and the way that language could be used to conceal and justify it. He saw how the wealthy and the powerful created their own reality, a world of self-serving myths and convenient fictions that bore little resemblance to the truth. He learned that to be poor was to be guilty, that to be weak was to be wrong. These were the first bitter lessons in the political education of George Orwell, the raw material from which he would later construct his terrifying vision of a world where truth is whatever the powerful say it is. Despite the misery of his school days, Eric's intellectual gifts could not be suppressed. He won scholarships to two of England's most prestigious public schools, Wellington and Eton. It was a triumph that vindicated his mother's faith in education and her sacrifices on his behalf. But it was also a reminder of his precarious position in the social hierarchy, a scholarship boy among the sons of the wealthy and the powerful. In the autumn of 1917, as the First World War raged across the continent and the Old World was dying in the trenches of France, Eric Blair arrived at Eton College, the most prestigious and socially exclusive of all English public schools. To win a scholarship to Eton was to be marked as one of the brightest boys of one's generation, a ticket into the inner sanctum of the British establishment. For a boy from Eric's background, the shabby genteel, lower upper middle class, it was a triumph, a validation of the sacrifices his family had made and the intellectual gifts he possessed. After a brief and unhappy period at Wellington College, where the military atmosphere and rigid discipline reminded him too much of the horrors of St. Cyprian's, Eric transferred to Eton in May 1917. The contrast could not have been more striking. Where Wellington was all spit and polish, Eton was relaxed and civilized. Where Wellington emphasized conformity and obedience, Eton celebrated individuality and intellectual achievement. For the first time in his educational career, Eric found himself in an environment where it was possible to be both intelligent and respected. Eton was a place of profound contradictions, a bastion of tradition and privilege that would both nurture and frustrate the rebellious spirit of the young man who would become George Orwell. The school had been founded in 1440 by King Henry VI as a charity school for poor scholars, but by the 20th century it had become the preserve of the wealthy and the powerful. The irony was not lost on Eric, who was acutely aware that he was there not because of his family's wealth but because of his own intellectual abilities. The atmosphere at Eton was a world away from the sadistic snobbery of St. Cyprian's. Here, intellectualism was not a crime to be punished, but a quality to be cultivated. The curriculum was broad and humane. The masters were often brilliant and eccentric, and the students were given a degree of freedom and autonomy that was unthinkable in most other schools. Eric was a King's Scholar, one of the 70 scholarship boys who lived in the college itself, a position that set him apart from the much larger and wealthier body of oppidans, the fee-paying students who boarded in houses around the town. The distinction was subtle but significant, a constant reminder of his social and economic inferiority. He was, as he later wrote, in the school but not of it, a critical observer of a world to which he could never fully belong. This sense of detachment, of being both an insider and an outsider, would become a defining characteristic of his literary persona, the source of his unique ability to dissect the customs and rituals of English life with the precision of an anthropologist. Among his teachers was Aldous Huxley, who taught French and would later become famous as the author of Brave New World. Huxley was a brilliant and unconventional teacher, a man whose sharp, cynical intelligence and fascination with the future would leave a lasting impression on his young pupil. Years later, when Orwell was writing 1984, he would acknowledge the influence of Huxley's dystopian vision, though his own nightmare would be far darker and more politically acute. Eric read voraciously during his time at Eton, exploring the works of modern writers like Shaw, Wells, and Galsworthy, who were challenging the social and political orthodoxies of the day. He discovered the satirical tradition of English literature, from Jonathan Swift to Samuel Butler. Writers who used wit and irony as weapons against hypocrisy and injustice. He contributed to college periodicals, including College Days and Election Times, honing his skills as a writer and developing the clear, muscular prose style that would become his trademark. His academic performance at Eton was, by his own admission, disgraceful. He finished 138th out of 167 boys in his year, a result that reflected not a lack of ability, but a deliberate rejection of the formal curriculum. He had the intellectual capacity to be a brilliant student, but he lacked the discipline and the motivation to apply himself to subjects that bored him. He was, as he later confessed, a rebel from the start, a boy who took a perverse pleasure in flouting the rules and disappointing the expectations of his masters. He was bored by the classical curriculum, with its emphasis on Greek and Latin, and drawn instead to the more immediate and relevant world of modern literature and politics. The First World War was raging, and Eric was acutely aware that his generation was living through a historical watershed. Many of his contemporaries would go straight from school to the trenches, and some would never return. The war gave a sense of urgency and relevance to everything, making the study of dead languages and ancient history seem trivial and irrelevant. Eric spent his time reading, writing, and talking, developing his own independent intellectual life outside the formal structures of the school. He was particularly drawn to the works of H.G. Wells, whose scientific romances and social novels offered a vision of the future that was both exciting and terrifying. Wells's belief in the power of education and rational planning to transform society would have a lasting influence on Eric's own political thinking, though he would later become deeply skeptical of Wells's optimistic faith in progress. He also discovered the works of Jack London, whose novels of adventure and social protest spoke to his own sense of alienation and rebellion. London's The Iron Heel, a dystopian novel about a fascist takeover of America, would later influence Orwell's own vision of totalitarianism. But perhaps the most important literary discovery of his Eton years was Jonathan Swift, whose savage satire and moral indignation would provide a model for Orwell's own satirical method. By the time he left Eton in December 1921, Eric Blair was a young man at a crossroads. He had received the best education that England could offer, but he had rejected the values and the worldview that came with it. He was a member of the ruling class, but he felt a deep and instinctive sympathy for the underdogs and the outsiders. He had the intellectual gifts to succeed in any number of professions, but he was uncertain about what he wanted to do with his life. Most of his contemporaries were heading to Oxford or Cambridge, the traditional next step on the path to power and influence. But Eric, in a decision that baffled his family and teachers, chose a different route. He had no desire to spend another 3 years in academic study, and his family could not afford the expense of university education. More importantly, he was eager to escape from the suffocating atmosphere of English class society and to test himself in the wider world. He decided to join the Indian Imperial Police, following in his father's footsteps and serving the empire that had shaped his early life. It was a choice that was both conventional and deeply rebellious. On the one hand, it was a way of securing a respectable career and earning a living. It was a practical choice for a young man without a private income, a way of seeing the world and gaining experience of life beyond the narrow confines of the English upper class, but on the other hand, it was a rejection of the intellectual and literary life that seemed to be his natural calling. It was a flight from the complexities and ambiguities of English society, a leap into a world of action and authority. He was turning his back on the life of the mind, or so it seemed, for the life of the colonial policeman. It was a decision that would take him to the furthest reaches of the British Empire, to the heart of the system that he was already beginning to question. The reluctant scholar was about to become the reluctant enforcer, a role that would provide the final, brutal, and necessary stage in his education. In Burma, he would learn lessons about power, oppression, and the nature of empire that no university could have taught him. The experience would transform him from Eric Blair, the product of the English class system, into the man who would become George Orwell, the conscience of his generation. In October 1922, at the age of 19, Eric Blair sailed for Burma aboard the SS Herefordshire. He was now an assistant district superintendent in the Indian Imperial Police, a servant of the British Empire, a guardian of the law in a land that was not his own. The 5 years he would spend in Burma were the crucible in which his political consciousness was forged. He went as a young man seeking adventure and a career. He would leave as a man burdened by a profound sense of guilt and a burning hatred of the imperial system he had served. The journey to Burma was itself an education in the realities of empire. The ship was divided into rigid class distinctions that mirrored the social hierarchy of British India. The first-class passengers were the senior officials, the military officers, and the wealthy merchants who formed the ruling elite of the Raj. The second-class passengers were the junior officials like Eric, the clerks and technicians who formed the backbone of the colonial administration. Below them, in the sweltering heat of the lower decks, were the Indian passengers, the subjects of the empire who were travelling to serve their British masters. Eric arrived in Rangoon in November 1922 and was immediately struck by the heat, the humidity, and the overwhelming sensory assault of the East. The city was a bustling commercial centre, a place where the wealth of Burma, its rice, its timber, its oil, was gathered and shipped to the markets of the world. But it was also a place of stark contrasts, where the luxury of the European quarter stood in sharp contrast to the squalor of the native districts. After a brief period of training in Rangoon, Eric was posted to Myeongmya, a small town in the Irrawaddy Delta. It was here that he began to learn the realities of colonial policing. His duties were varied and often unpleasant. He supervised police patrols, investigated crimes, and presided over local courts. He was responsible for maintaining law and order in a district that covered hundreds of square miles and contained tens of thousands of people, most of whom regarded him with a mixture of fear, resentment, and contempt. The work was lonely and often dangerous. Eric lived in a large, isolated bungalow, surrounded by servants who were polite but distant. He had few European companions, and those he did meet were often crude and racist men who had been brutalized by years of colonial service. The climate was oppressive, the food was poor, and the constant threat of disease hung over everything. Many young men broke under the strain, succumbing to drink, depression, or tropical diseases. But Eric was made of sterner stuff. He threw himself into his work with characteristic intensity, learning the local languages and studying the customs of the people he was supposed to govern. He was, by all accounts, a competent and efficient officer, a man who took his responsibilities seriously. He developed a reputation for fairness and integrity, qualities that were rare among the colonial police. He was promoted regularly and was clearly marked for advancement within the service. But beneath the surface, a profound transformation was taking place. For the first time in his life, Eric Blair was seeing the British Empire from the inside, from the perspective of those who enforced its will. He saw the casual racism, the petty tyrannies, the soul-crushing boredom of colonial life. He saw how the system dehumanized both the rulers and the ruled, trapping them in a cycle of resentment and misunderstanding. He was posted to a series of stations throughout Burma: Myeongmya, Twante, Sirium, Insein, and finally Kata in the far north. Each posting brought new insights into the nature of imperial rule. In Twante, he witnessed the brutal suppression of a minor rebellion. In Sirium, he saw the environmental destruction caused by the oil industry. In Insein, he presided over cases that revealed the corruption and incompetence of the colonial administration. But it was in Katha, his final posting, that Eric's disillusionment reached its peak. Katha was a remote outpost on the Irrawaddy River, a place where the veneer of civilization was thin and the realities of imperial rule were starkly apparent. It was here that he encountered the incidents that would later inspire his most famous essays about Burma: a hanging and shooting an elephant. The hanging he witnessed was a routine execution, the kind of event that happened regularly throughout the empire. But for Eric, it became a moment of profound moral revelation. As he watched the condemned man walk to the gallows, stepping aside to avoid a puddle, he was struck by the terrible wrongness of cutting a life short when it was in full tide. "It is curious," he would later write, "but till that moment I had never realized what it means to destroy a healthy, conscious man." In that small, seemingly insignificant gesture, the whole brutal reality of capital punishment was laid bare. The incident with the elephant was equally revealing. A tame elephant had gone into must, a periodic condition of heightened aggression, and had killed a man. Eric was called to deal with the situation and found himself facing a crowd of expectant Burmese who wanted to see the elephant shot. He did not want to kill the animal, which had already calmed down and was peacefully eating grass. But he felt compelled to do so by the expectations of the crowd. "I perceived in this moment," he wrote, "that when the white man turns tyrant, it is his own freedom that he destroys." The incident became a powerful metaphor for the moral bankruptcy of imperialism. Eric realized that in his role as a colonial policeman, he had become a mere puppet, a hollow figure whose actions were determined by the will of the people he was supposed to be ruling. "He wears a mask," he wrote of the white man in the East, "and his face grows to fit it." By 1927, the mask had become unbearable. Eric was increasingly troubled by his role in the imperial system. He saw himself as a cog in a machine of oppression, a man who was complicit in the subjugation of an entire people. The guilt and shame he felt were compounded by his growing awareness of the nationalist movement that was stirring throughout Burma. He could see that the days of British rule were numbered, that the empire was built on foundations of sand. While on leave in England in the summer of 1927, Eric made the momentous decision not to return to Burma. He spent months agonizing over the choice, walking the streets of London and the countryside of Suffolk, trying to come to terms with what he was about to do. On January 1, 1928, he officially resigned from the Indian Imperial Police, citing ill health as the reason for his departure. It was a decision that would change the course of his life, a definitive break with his family, his class, and his past. His parents were shocked and disappointed. His former colleagues were baffled. His prospects for a conventional career were ruined. But Eric felt a profound sense of relief. He had rejected the life of the Sahib, the life of the imperial ruler, and in doing so, he had taken the first crucial step on the road to becoming George Orwell. The policeman's awakening was complete. He had learned lessons about power, oppression, and the nature of empire that would inform everything he wrote for the rest of his life. He had seen how language could be used to conceal and justify brutality, how the powerful could create their own version of reality, how ordinary people could be turned into instruments of oppression. These insights would later find their fullest expression in Animal Farm and 1984. But their origins lay in the dusty streets and sweltering police stations of colonial Burma. The writer's journey was about to begin, but it would start not with literary ambition, but with a desperate need for expiation, a desire to atone for his complicity in the imperial system by experiencing life from the perspective of the oppressed rather than the oppressor. Having shed the skin of the imperial policeman, Eric Blair felt a profound need for penance. He was haunted by the guilt of his role in Burma, by the memory of the power he had wielded over a subject people. He felt that he needed to understand what it was like to be on the other side of the social equation, to be one of the oppressed rather than one of the oppressors. And so, in the autumn of 1927, even before his official resignation from the police, he embarked on a deliberate and systematic journey into the world of poverty and social exclusion. It was a journey that would take him to the slums of London and Paris, to the tramps' wards of rural England, and to the hop fields of Kent. It was a journey that would provide the material for his first book and lay the foundations for his unique brand of politically engaged literature. But more than that, it was a journey of moral and psychological transformation, a deliberate attempt to expiate his guilt and to understand the world from the perspective of those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. He began in the East End of London, a world of cheap lodging houses, casual labour, and chronic poverty. He dressed in ragged clothes, lived on bread and tea, and spent his days in the company of beggars, drunks, and petty criminals. He was not a tourist or a sociologist. He was a participant, a man who was trying to understand poverty from the inside. He learned the slang, the customs, the unwritten rules of this subterranean world. He learned what it was like to be hungry, to be cold, to be invisible to the respectable world that passed by on the other side of the street. The lodging houses where he stayed were grim and squalid places, filled with the human wreckage of industrial society. There were old soldiers broken by war, labourers worn out by years of hard work, and young men who had never had a chance in life. There were also criminals and con men, but Eric found that even these were often victims of circumstances beyond their control. He learned to see poverty not as a moral failing, but as a structural problem, a consequence of an economic system that condemned millions to lives of desperation and want. From London, he went to Paris, where he lived in a working-class district and worked as a plongeur, a dishwasher, in the steamy, chaotic kitchens of fashionable hotels and restaurants. It was a life of grueling, mind-numbing labour, of 16-hour days and 7-day weeks, a life that reduced a man to a mere machine. He worked at the Hotel X, a fictional name for what was probably the Hotel Lottie, where he experienced firsthand the brutal exploitation of restaurant workers. The kitchen was a vision of hell, a place of scalding steam, deafening noise, and constant pressure. The work was backbreaking and dangerous, and the pay was barely enough to survive on. Eric saw how the luxury and elegance of the Parisian beau monde was built on the sweated labour of an army of invisible workers. The experience gave him a visceral understanding of the mechanics of class exploitation, a lesson that he would never forget. He lived in a cheap hotel in the Rue du Coq d'Or, a narrow street in the Latin Quarter that was home to a diverse collection of outcasts and misfits. There was Boris, a Russian émigré who had once been a captain in the Tsar's army. Charlie, an English public school boy who had fallen on hard times. And Madame F., the proprietress of the hotel who ruled her domain with an iron fist. These characters would later appear, thinly disguised, in Down and Out in Paris and London. The poverty Eric experienced in Paris was different from that in London. In London, poverty was often a matter of unemployment and social exclusion. In Paris, it was more often a matter of exploitation and overwork. The poor worked incredibly hard for incredibly little, trapped in a system that seemed designed to keep them in perpetual servitude. Eric learned that poverty was not just about lack of money. It was about lack of time, lack of energy, lack of hope. Back in England, he took to the road, tramping from one casual ward to another, living the life of a professional vagrant. The casual wards were a Victorian institution, workhouses where the destitute could get a night's shelter in exchange for a day's work. They were deliberately made as unpleasant as possible, to discourage people from using them unless they were truly desperate. Eric experienced the petty tyrannies of workhouse masters, the camaraderie of the road, the constant, gnawing uncertainty of a life without roots or security. He learned the elaborate etiquette of tramp life, the unwritten rules that governed behavior on the road. He discovered that many tramps were not lazy or work-shy, as popular prejudice suggested, but were victims of economic forces beyond their control. He joined the annual exodus of London's poor to the hop fields of Kent, a form of seasonal labour that was both a holiday and a form of exploitation. The hop-picking season was one of the few times when the urban poor could escape the city and earn a little extra money. Whole families would travel to Kent. Living in primitive huts and working long hours in the fields, Eric saw how the rhythms of rural life were governed by the same economic forces that shaped the lives of the urban poor. These experiences, which lasted for several years, were the raw material for his first book, Down and Out in Paris and London, published in 1933. It was for this book that he adopted the pseudonym George Orwell. The name was a deliberate act of self-creation, a way of signalling his break with his past and his new identity as a writer. George was a quintessentially English name, solid and dependable. Orwell was the name of a river in Suffolk, a place that he loved. The name was a declaration of his Englishness, but it was an Englishness that was rooted in the landscape and the common people, not in the class-bound world of his upbringing. The choice of pseudonym was also practical. Eric Blair was still a relatively young man from a respectable family, and the publication of a book about his experiences among tramps and dishwashers would have been deeply embarrassing to his relatives. The pseudonym allowed him to write freely about his experiences without bringing shame on his family name. Down and Out in Paris and London was a groundbreaking work, a book that blurred the lines between memoir, journalism, and social commentary. It was a book that gave a voice to the voiceless, that made the invisible visible. It was written in a clear, direct, unadorned prose that was a world away from the literary affectations of the time. The book was influenced by the tradition of social investigation that had been pioneered by writers like Henry Mayhew and Charles Booth, but it was also something new, a work of literature that was based on lived experience rather than external observation. The book was not an immediate bestseller, but it was well received by critics and established Eric Blair, now George Orwell, as a writer to watch. It was praised for its honesty, its compassion, and its unflinching portrayal of poverty and social injustice. The book also established many of the themes that would run through all of Orwell's later work: the corrupting effects of power, the importance of human dignity, the need to bear witness to suffering and injustice. The experience of writing the book was as important as the experience of living the life it described. Orwell discovered that he had a gift for clear, powerful prose, ability to transform personal experience into universal truth. He learned that writing could be a form of political action, a way of challenging the comfortable assumptions of the middle class and forcing them to confront the realities of poverty and exploitation. The man who had gone down and out had come back up as a writer with a unique and powerful voice, a writer who would become the conscience of his generation. But the journey was far from over. The experiences of poverty had given him a new perspective on society, but they had also raised new questions about the nature of social justice and the possibility of political change. The next phase of his journey would take him deeper into the world of politics and ideology, as he struggled to find a way to translate his moral insights into effective political action. The success of Down and Out in Paris and London marked the arrival of George Orwell as a significant new voice in English literature, but it was only the beginning of his journey. The 1930s were a period of intense political and creative activity for Orwell, a time when he honed his skills as a novelist, sharpened his political analysis, and committed himself to the socialist cause. It was also the decade in which he met and married Eileen O'Shaughnessy. a woman whose intelligence and spirit would have a profound and often underestimated influence on his life and work. His novels of this period are a fascinating record of his attempt to find a fictional form for his evolving political and social concerns. Burmese Days, published in 1934, was a powerful and bitter exorcism of his colonial past. The novel tells the story of John Flory, a sensitive and disillusioned timber merchant in Burma who finds himself caught between the racist snobbery of the English club and his genuine sympathy for the Burmese people. Flory is clearly a version of Orwell himself, a man who has seen through the myths of empire but lacks the courage to act on his convictions. The novel is set in Kiauktada, a fictional town based on Kata, where Orwell had served during his final year in Burma. The European club, with its rigid racial exclusions and petty snobberies, becomes a microcosm of the imperial system. Flory's tragic end, a suicide born of despair and social isolation, is a powerful indictment of the imperial system and its corrosive effect on human relationships. The book was considered too controversial to be published in Britain initially and first appeared in the United States. It remains one of the most searing and honest accounts of the psychology of imperialism ever written. The novel also introduced themes that would run through all of Orwell's later work: the corrupting effects of power, the difficulty of maintaining personal integrity in a corrupt system, and the tragic consequences of moral cowardice. Flory's inability to stand up to the racism of his fellow Europeans makes him complicit in the very system he despises, a theme that would later find its fullest expression in 1984. His next novel, A Clergyman's Daughter, 1935, was a more experimental work that explored the suffocating constraints of English middle-class life. The novel tells the story of Dorothy Hare, an unhappy spinster who, after a bout of amnesia, finds a strange and temporary liberation among the hop-pickers and vagrants of rural England. The book draws heavily on Orwell's own experiences of poverty and tramping, but it is less successful as a novel than as a social document. The experimental sections of the book, particularly the stream of consciousness passages that describe Dorothy's mental breakdown, show Orwell experimenting with modernist techniques, but he was never entirely comfortable with literary experimentation, preferring the clear, direct prose that would become his trademark. The book is interesting as a record of his artistic development, but it lacks the power and focus of his later work. Keep the Aspidistra Flying, 1936, is a fiercer and funnier satire on the soul-destroying power of money. Its protagonist, Gordon Comstock, is a struggling poet who declares war on the money god and the Aspidistra, the ubiquitous potted plant that he sees as the symbol of bourgeois respectability. Gordon's rebellion against middle-class values is both heroic and absurd, and his eventual capitulation to social convention is both inevitable and tragic. The novel is clearly autobiographical, drawing on Orwell's own struggles as a young writer trying to make a living from his pen. Gordon's poverty is not the romantic poverty of the bohemian artist, but the grinding, humiliating poverty of the unsuccessful middle-class man. The book is a savage indictment of a society that judges people by their bank balance, but it is also a compassionate portrait of a man trapped by his own pride and idealism. All three novels are flawed, as Orwell himself later admitted, but they are also full of sharp social observation and a generous anger at the injustices of a class-ridden society. They established Orwell as a novelist of considerable promise, but they also revealed the limitations of fiction as a vehicle for his political concerns. He was more interested in truth than in art, more concerned with changing the world than with creating beautiful objects. It was during this period that Orwell's political convictions began to solidify. His experiences in Burma and his journey through the world of poverty had given him a visceral hatred of oppression and a deep sympathy for the underdog. He began to call himself a socialist, but his was a socialism that was rooted in the English radical tradition, a socialism of decency, liberty, and fair play, not the rigid dogmatic Marxism that was fashionable among many intellectuals of the time. He was drawn to socialism not by abstract theory but by concrete experience. He had seen how the imperial system oppressed the Burmese, how the economic system exploited the poor, how the class system humiliated and degraded ordinary people. His socialism was emotional rather than intellectual, based on a sense of justice rather than a theory of history. In the spring of 1935, his life was transformed by his meeting with Eileen O'Shaughnessy. She was 30 years old, a graduate of St Hugh's College, Oxford, where she had studied English literature. She was working on a master's degree in psychology at University College London, writing a thesis on the measurement of intelligence. She was a woman of sharp intelligence, independent spirit, and a mordant wit that matched his own. They met at a party in Hampstead, and Orwell was immediately smitten. According to one account, he told a friend that evening, "That's the girl I'm going to marry." Eileen was less immediately impressed, but she was intrigued by this tall, gaunt man with his intense blue eyes and his passionate commitment to social justice. Their courtship was conducted largely through letters, as Orwell was living in a cottage in Wallington, Hertfordshire, trying to make a living as a writer. The cottage was primitive, with no electricity or running water, but it was cheap, and it gave him the solitude he needed to write. Eileen would visit him there, and they would walk in the countryside and talk about books and politics. They were married on June 9, 1936, in the parish church of Wallington. It was a small ceremony, attended only by close friends and family. Eileen wore a simple dress and carried a bouquet of wildflowers. Orwell, who was not a religious man, insisted on a church wedding because he was, as he put it, sufficiently a traditionalist to wish to be married in it. Their life together was a partnership of equals, a meeting of minds and spirits that would sustain them through the turbulent years ahead. Eileen was more than just Orwell's wife. She was his first reader, his most astute critic, his collaborator, and his conscience. She typed his manuscripts, corrected his grammar, and offered suggestions that often improved his work. Her influence on his writing, particularly on Animal Farm, is a subject of growing recognition among scholars. In 1936, Orwell was commissioned by the publisher Victor Gollancz to write a book about the conditions of the unemployed in the industrial north of England. Gollancz was a left-wing publisher who was trying to educate the middle class about the realities of working-class life. The commission came at a perfect time for Orwell, who was struggling financially and was eager to combine his literary ambitions with his political concerns. The result was The Road to Wigan Pier, a book that is as much a journey into Orwell's own conscience as it is a report on social conditions. The first half of the book is a brilliant and unforgettable piece of reportage, a vivid and harrowing account of his time living among the miners of Lancashire and Yorkshire. He went down the mines, lived in their squalid houses, and observed their lives with a mixture of compassion and unflinching honesty. He saw the poverty, the disease, the sheer grinding hardship of their existence. But he also saw their courage, their humour, and their indomitable spirit. He was particularly struck by the dignity and resilience of the miners' wives, who managed to maintain their families' morale despite the most appalling conditions. The book contains some of the most powerful social writing in the English language, passages that burn with moral indignation and human sympathy. The second half of The Road to Wigan Pier is a long and deeply personal essay in which Orwell explores the meaning of socialism and his own complex relationship with the class system. It is a work of fierce and often uncomfortable honesty, a book in which he confronts his own prejudices and the prejudices of his class. He attacks the crankiness, the jargon, and the intellectual snobbery of much of the socialist movement of his time, arguing that it had become alienated from the very people it was supposed to represent. The book was a challenge to the socialist orthodoxy of the day, and it established Orwell as one of the most original and important political writers of his generation. It also revealed the complexity of his political thinking. his ability to combine passionate commitment with critical intelligence. By the time it was published in March 1937, however, Orwell was already in Spain, fighting for the cause he had so passionately and critically embraced. In December 1936, George Orwell went to Spain. He went initially as a journalist, intending to report on the civil war that had broken out between the elected Republican government and the fascist forces of General Francisco Franco. But for a man of Orwell's temperament, observation was not enough. He was a man who needed to participate, to bear witness not just with his pen, but with his body. Within days of his arrival in Barcelona, he had joined the militia of the POUM, Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista, a small anti-Stalinist Marxist party, and was on his way to the front. The decision to go to Spain was both impulsive and inevitable. Orwell had been following the progress of the war with growing concern and excitement. The Spanish Republic represented everything he believed in: democracy, socialism, and the fight against fascism. When the opportunity arose to go to Spain as a correspondent for the New English Weekly, he seized it immediately. Eileen supported his decision, though she must have known the dangers involved. The Spain that Orwell found was a place of revolutionary fervour and hope. In Barcelona, the anarchists were in control, and for a brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed as if a genuine workers' revolution was taking place. It was, he later wrote, the first time that I had ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle. The city was plastered with revolutionary posters. The churches had been turned into workers' clubs, and the very air seemed to vibrate with the energy of social transformation. Orwell was immediately struck by the atmosphere of equality and comradeship that prevailed in revolutionary Barcelona. Class distinctions had been temporarily abolished. Servants and masters addressed each other as equals, and the usual deference to wealth and status had disappeared. It was a vision of the socialist future that he had dreamed of, a world where the barriers of class and money had been torn down, where people treated each other as human beings rather than as economic units. He joined the POM militia rather than the international brigades because of a letter of introduction from the Independent Labour Party with which the POM was affiliated. The POM was a small, Trotskyist organisation that was critical of Stalin's Soviet Union, a position that would later prove to be both prescient and dangerous. Orwell knew little about the complex politics of the Spanish left when he arrived, but he would learn quickly and painfully about the bitter divisions that were tearing the Republican cause apart. After a brief period of training in Barcelona, Orwell was sent to the Aragon front, where he served in the trenches near Huesca. His time on the front was a mixture of boredom, discomfort, and occasional terror. The fighting was sporadic, a matter of trench warfare and sniper fire that reminded him of the Western Front in the First World War. The conditions were brutal. He was cold, hungry, and lice-ridden, but he was also inspired by the courage and camaraderie of his fellow militiamen. His comrades were a motley collection of Spanish workers and foreign volunteers who had come to fight for the Republic. There were Catalan factory workers, Aragonese peasants, German refugees from Hitler, and English intellectuals like himself. Despite their different backgrounds, they were united by a common cause and a shared sense of purpose. Orwell was promoted to the rank of second lieutenant, a testament to his natural leadership and his commitment to the cause. The military situation on the Aragon front was largely static. The Republican forces lacked the equipment and training to mount a successful offensive, while the nationalist forces were content to hold their positions and wait for reinforcements. The war had settled into a stalemate that would last for months. Orwell spent his time in the trenches reading, writing letters to Eileen, and trying to stay warm and dry. But the revolutionary idyll was not to last. In May 1937, while on leave in Barcelona, Orwell was caught up in the so-called May Days, a brutal and bloody conflict between the different factions of the Republican side. The Stalinist-led communists, acting on orders from Moscow, were determined to crush their political rivals, particularly the anarchists and the POUM. The Soviet Union was providing crucial aid to the Republic, but it came with strings attached. Stalin wanted to eliminate all opposition to his control of the international communist movement. Orwell found himself on the barricades, fighting not against the fascists, but against his supposed comrades on the left. It was a bitter and disillusioning experience, a lesson in the brutal realities of power politics and the cynicism of the communist movement. He saw how the communists used their control of weapons and supplies to eliminate their rivals, how they spread lies and propaganda to justify their actions, how they betrayed the very ideals for which the war was supposedly being fought. The fighting in Barcelona lasted for several days, with hundreds of casualties on both sides. Orwell was shocked by the viciousness of the conflict and by the willingness of the communists to use violence against their own allies. He began to understand that the war was not just a struggle between fascism and democracy, but also a struggle between different visions of socialism. The communists wanted a centralized authoritarian socialism controlled from Moscow. The anarchists and the POUM wanted a decentralized democratic socialism controlled by the workers themselves. He returned to the front, but the revolutionary spirit had been broken. The POUM militia was being disbanded and its members were being arrested or shot as Trotskyist traitors. The atmosphere of equality and comradeship that had characterized the early days of the war had been replaced by suspicion and fear. Orwell could see that the revolution was being betrayed by its own leaders. A few weeks later, on May 20th, 1937, he was shot in the throat by a sniper's bullet while manning an observation post near Huesca. The bullet passed through his neck, missing his carotid artery by millimeters. He was lucky to survive, but the injury was serious enough to require immediate medical attention. He was evacuated to a hospital in Lleida, where he spent several weeks recovering. The wound permanently damaged his voice, giving it a characteristic hoarseness that would remain with him for the rest of his life. But the physical injury was less significant than the psychological trauma of what he had witnessed while he was recovering. The communists declared the POUM an illegal organization, and a wave of arrests and executions began. Many of his comrades were imprisoned or shot, accused of being fascist spies and saboteurs. Orwell and Eileen, who had come to Barcelona to work for the POUM, were forced to flee Spain in fear of their lives. They escaped across the border into France just ahead of the secret police, leaving behind their belongings and their illusions about the nature of the communist movement. The experience had transformed Orwell from a hopeful socialist into a confirmed anti-Stalinist. He returned from Spain a changed man. He had gone as a hopeful revolutionary. He came back as a confirmed anti-Stalinist. He had seen firsthand how the noble ideals of socialism could be betrayed by the lust for power, how a revolution could be devoured by its own children. The experience left him with a lifelong dread of communism and a deep understanding of the nature of totalitarianism. He had learned that the greatest threat to liberty could come not just from the right, but also from the left, from those who claimed to be fighting for the liberation of humanity. His account of his Spanish experiences, Homage to Catalonia, published in 1938, is one of the great classics of war literature. It is a book of unflinching honesty, a book that tells the truth about the heroism and the betrayal, the hope and the disillusionment of the Spanish Civil War. The book is both a personal memoir and a political analysis, a work that combines vivid descriptions of life in the trenches with a devastating critique of communist tactics. The book was not popular when it was first published. The left-wing establishment in Britain was still in thrall to the Soviet Union and did not want to hear the truth about what had happened in Spain. Many of Orwell's former allies on the left accused him of being a fascist sympathizer or a Trotskyist wrecker. The book sold poorly and was largely ignored by the mainstream press, But Homage to Catalonia has endured as one of the most important books about the Spanish Civil War and one of the first major works to expose the true nature of Stalinism. It is a testament to Orwell's courage, his integrity, and his unwavering commitment to the truth. No matter how uncomfortable or inconvenient it might be, the Spanish Crucible had forged the writer who would go on to create Animal Farm and 1984, the writer who would become the great prophet of the totalitarian age. The outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939 found George Orwell in a state of political and personal turmoil. His experiences in Spain had left him deeply disillusioned with the left, but his hatred of fascism was as strong as ever. He was a patriot, a man who loved England, but he was also a revolutionary who believed that the war could only be won if it was transformed into a socialist revolution. This complex and often contradictory set of beliefs is brilliantly articulated in his wartime essay, The Lion and the Unicorn, Socialism and the English Genius. The period between his return from Spain and the outbreak of war was one of the most productive of Orwell's career. He wrote Homage to Catalonia, which was published in 1938 to critical acclaim but poor sales. He also wrote Coming Up for Air, 1939, his last novel before Animal Farm. The book tells the story of George Bowling, a middle-aged insurance salesman who returns to his childhood village in search of the England he remembers from before the First World War. The novel is both a nostalgic evocation of a lost world and a prophetic warning about the totalitarian future that Orwell saw approaching. When war broke out, Orwell was eager to contribute to the fight against fascism, but his attempts to enlist were frustrated by his poor health. He was rejected by the army because of his damaged lungs, a legacy of his time in Burma and his bout of pneumonia in 1933. He was also rejected by the Home Guard because of his political views. His association with the POUM and his criticism of the Soviet Union had marked him as a security risk in the eyes of the authorities. Frustrated by his inability to serve in a military capacity, Orwell threw himself into the war effort in other ways. He wrote articles and reviews for various publications, arguing for a more aggressive prosecution of the war and for the social reforms that he believed were necessary to win it. He also joined the Home Guard when it was finally formed in 1940, serving as a sergeant in a unit that was responsible for defending the area around his home in Hertfordshire. In August 1941, Orwell found work at the BBC, where he was employed as a producer in the Eastern Service, broadcasting propaganda to India and Southeast Asia. It was a job that he came to despise, a daily lesson in the art of official lying and bureaucratic inertia. He was required to produce programs that supported British policy in India, even though he was personally opposed to imperialism and believed that India should be granted independence. The work at the BBC was both tedious and morally compromising. Orwell was required to write scripts that presented the British war effort in the most favourable light possible, while downplaying or ignoring inconvenient facts. He had to work with Indian intellectuals who were collaborating with the British authorities, men whom he respected personally but whose political positions he found abhorrent. The experience would provide him with invaluable material for his depiction of the Ministry of Truth in 1984. Despite his dislike of the work, Orwell took his responsibilities seriously. He tried to make his programs as honest and informative as possible within the constraints imposed by official policy. He also used his position to help other writers and intellectuals, commissioning talks and programs from people like E.M. Forster, T.S. Eliot, and Dylan Thomas. But the strain of the work, combined with his poor health and his growing disillusionment with the war effort, began to take its toll. It was during the war years that Orwell and Eileen adopted a son, Richard Horatio Blair, born in May 1944. The decision to adopt was a testament to their desire for a family, a small act of hope and affirmation in a world that seemed to be descending into darkness. They had been trying to have children for several years, but Eileen had been unable to conceive. The adoption gave them both great joy, and Orwell proved to be a devoted and loving father, a man who found great pleasure in the simple domestic routines of parenthood. The child was named after Richard Blair, Orwell's father, and Horatio Nelson, the great naval hero. The choice of names reflected Orwell's complex relationship with his family and his country. He was proud of his English heritage, but he was also critical of the imperial tradition that had shaped his early life. The adoption of Richard gave him a new sense of purpose and responsibility, a reason to hope for a better future. But the war years were also marked by personal tragedy. Eileen's health had been declining for some time, and she was suffering from a variety of ailments that the doctors were unable to diagnose properly. She was tired and depressed, worn down by the strain of wartime life and the constant worry about money. Orwell was often away from home, either working at the BBC or travelling as a war correspondent, and Eileen was left to cope with the demands of motherhood and household management largely on her own. In March 1945, while Orwell was in Paris as a correspondent for The Observer and the Manchester Evening News, Eileen underwent what was supposed to be a routine hysterectomy. She had been suffering from severe abdominal pain, and the doctors had recommended surgery to remove what they believed to be a benign tumour. But the operation went wrong, and Eileen died on the operating table from a heart attack caused by the anaesthetic. She was just 39 years old. The news of Eileen's death was a devastating blow to Orwell, a loss from which he would never fully recover. He rushed back from Paris, but he arrived too late to see her alive. He was left a widower with a young son, a man who had lost not just his wife but his closest friend and most trusted intellectual companion. The grief and loneliness of this period would cast a long shadow over the final years of his life, a shadow that is palpable in the bleak and desolate landscapes of 1984. Eileen's death also marked the end of an era in Orwell's life. She had been his partner in every sense of the word, a woman who had shared his political convictions and his literary ambitions. She had typed his manuscripts, corrected his grammar, and offered suggestions that often improved his work. Her influence on his writing, particularly on Animal Farm, which was written during their marriage, is only now beginning to be fully recognized by scholars. The loss of Eileen left Orwell emotionally devastated and practically overwhelmed. He was now a single father with a demanding career and a precarious income. He was also in poor health, suffering from the tuberculosis that would eventually kill him. The war was coming to an end, but for Orwell, the victory felt hollow and incomplete. He had lost the person who mattered most to him, and the world that emerged from the war seemed to offer little hope for the kind of socialist transformation he had dreamed of. But even in his grief, Orwell continued to write. In the final months of the war, he was working on Animal Farm, the book that would make him famous and financially secure for the first time in his life. The fable of the farm animals who overthrow their human masters, only to be enslaved by their own kind, was a devastating satire on the Russian Revolution and the betrayal of socialist ideals by Stalin's Soviet Union. It was also in many ways a tribute to Eileen, whose wit and intelligence had helped to shape the book's satirical vision. In the midst of the Second World War, while working at the BBC and struggling with the grief of his wife's declining health, George Orwell conceived of a story that would become his most famous and enduring work. It was a simple story, a fable about a group of farm animals who overthrow their human master and establish a society of their own. But it was also a devastating satire on the Russian Revolution and the betrayal of socialist ideals by the Soviet Union. The book was Animal Farm, and its creation was an act of political courage and artistic genius. Orwell had been thinking about the story for several years, ever since his experiences in Spain had opened his eyes to the true nature of Stalinist communism. The idea came to him, he later wrote, when he saw a small boy driving a huge cart horse and thought, "It struck me that if only such animals became aware of their strength, we should have no power over them, and that men exploit animals in much the same way as the rich exploit the proletariat." He wanted to write a book that would expose the Soviet myth, a book that would be accessible to a wide audience and could be easily translated into other languages. The form of the animal fable was a stroke of genius, a way of simplifying a complex political history without sacrificing its essential truth. The story of the pigs who become more tyrannical than the humans they replaced was a powerful and unforgettable allegory for the corruption of revolutionary ideals. The book was written between November 1943 and February 1944, during some of the darkest days of Orwell's personal life. Eileen was seriously ill. He was struggling with his own health problems, and the demands of his job at the BBC were becoming increasingly burdensome. But the writing of Animal Farm gave him a sense of purpose and direction, a way of channeling his political anger and personal grief into a work of art. The story follows the animals of Manor Farm as they rebel against their drunken and neglectful owner, Mr. Jones, and establish their own society based on the principles of animalism. The rebellion is inspired by the teachings of Old Major, a wise old boar who represents a combination of Marx and Lenin. After Old Major's death, the revolution is led by two pigs, Napoleon and Snowball, who represent Stalin and Trotsky respectively. Initially, the revolution is a success. The animals work together to build a better society, guided by the 7 commandments of animalism, the most important of which is all animals are equal. But gradually, the pigs begin to assume more and more power, justifying their privileges by claiming that they need to think for the other animals. Napoleon eventually drives Snowball into exile and establishes himself as the sole leader of the farm. Under Napoleon's rule, the farm becomes increasingly totalitarian. The pigs move into the farmhouse and begin to walk on 2 legs, wearing clothes and drinking alcohol. They rewrite the commandments to suit their own purposes, until finally there is only one commandment left. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. The book ends with the pigs becoming indistinguishable from the humans they once opposed. The allegory is both precise and universal. Every major character and event in the book corresponds to a figure or event in Soviet history. Old Major is Marx and Lenin, Napoleon is Stalin, Snowball is Trotsky, and Boxer, the cart horse, represents the loyal but exploited working class. The Battle of the Cowshed represents the Russian Civil War. The windmill represents the 5-year plans, and the final scene, where the pigs and humans play cards together, represents the Tehran Conference of 1943, where Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill met to discuss the post-war world. But the book is more than just a satire on Soviet communism. It is also a meditation on the nature of power and the ease with which revolutionary ideals can be corrupted. The pigs' gradual transformation from liberators to oppressors is a universal story, one that applies to any revolution that has been betrayed by its leaders. The book's enduring popularity is due in large part to its ability to speak to readers who know nothing about Soviet history, but who recognize the patterns of corruption and betrayal that it describes. Orwell had great difficulty finding a publisher for Animal Farm. The Soviet Union was Britain's ally in the war against Nazi Germany, and few publishers were willing to risk offending the Stalinist regime. The book was rejected by several leading publishing houses, including Faber and Faber, where T.S. Eliot was an editor. Eliot's rejection letter is a fascinating document, a testament to the political climate of the time. He praised the book's literary merits, but argued that it was not the right time to be criticizing the Soviet Union. Jonathan Cape initially accepted the book, but then withdrew the offer after being advised by the Ministry of Information that it would be unwise to publish it. Gollancz, Orwell's usual publisher, refused even to consider it. The book was finally accepted by Frederick Warburg of Secker and Warburg, a small but courageous publisher who was willing to take the risk. Even then, the book's publication was delayed by the paper shortage that affected all British publishers during the war. Animal Farm finally appeared in August 1945, just as the war was ending and the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union was beginning to crumble. The timing was perfect. The book appeared just as people were beginning to question the nature of the Soviet regime and to worry about Stalin's intentions in Eastern Europe. The book was an immediate success. It was praised by critics across the political spectrum and became a bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic. The American edition, published by Harcourt Brace in 1946, was particularly successful, selling over 500,000 copies in its first year. The book was translated into dozens of languages and became one of the most widely read books of the 20th century. The success of Animal Farm transformed Orwell's life. For the first time, he was financially secure, able to give up his job at the BBC and concentrate on his writing. The book's royalties would support him for the rest of his life and provide for his son after his death. But the success came at a personal cost. Eileen died just a few months before the book's publication, and she never lived to see her husband achieve the recognition he deserved. The book also established Orwell as one of the most important political writers of his generation. Animal Farm was more than just a successful novel. It was a political weapon, a book that helped to shape public opinion about the Soviet Union and the nature of totalitarianism. The book's influence extended far beyond the literary world, affecting political discourse and policymaking in the emerging Cold War. But perhaps the most important achievement of Animal Farm was its demonstration that literature could be both artistically successful and politically effective. Orwell had found a way to combine his moral convictions with his artistic ambitions, creating a work that was both a powerful piece of propaganda and a timeless work of art. The Fabulist's triumph was complete, but it was a triumph that was overshadowed by personal loss and the growing darkness of his own declining health. The success of Animal Farm also gave Orwell the confidence and the financial security to embark on his final and greatest work, 1984. The book that would make him immortal was already taking shape in his mind, a darker and more complex vision of the totalitarian future that he saw approaching. The man who had given the world its most memorable fable was about to give it its most terrifying prophecy. In the aftermath of the war and the success of Animal Farm, George Orwell retreated to the remote Scottish island of Jura. He was a sick man, his tuberculosis now in an advanced stage, and he was seeking a place of solitude and natural beauty where he could write the book that had been gestating in his mind for years. That book was 1984, and its creation was a race against death. A final, desperate attempt to warn the world about the dangers of the totalitarian future he saw approaching. The decision to move to Jura was both practical and symbolic. Orwell needed to escape from the literary world of London, with its distractions and social obligations, and find a place where he could concentrate on his writing. But he also needed to find a place that was cheap enough for him to afford on his modest income. Despite the success of Animal Farm, Orwell was not a wealthy man, and he was supporting not only himself and his young son, but also his sister Avril, who had come to live with him after Eileen's death. Jura was perfect for his needs. It was remote, beautiful, and almost completely cut off from the modern world. The farmhouse where he lived, called Barnhill, was primitive by any standard. There was no electricity, no telephone, and no running water. The nearest shop was 7 miles away, and the nearest doctor was on the mainland, a journey that could take hours in bad weather. But for Orwell, it was also a kind of paradise, a place where he could escape from the complexities of modern life and reconnect with the natural world he loved. The life on Jura was harsh but rewarding. Orwell threw himself into the work of farming and fishing, activities that gave him great pleasure and helped to restore his physical and mental health. He kept chickens and goats, grew vegetables, and caught fish in the surrounding waters. He also spent long hours walking on the moors and beaches, observing the wildlife and absorbing the stark beauty of the landscape. It was here, in this remote and beautiful landscape, that he created the bleak and terrifying world of Oceania, a world of perpetual war, government surveillance, and thought control. The contrast between the natural beauty of Jura and the nightmare world of 1984 could not have been more striking. It was as if Orwell was drawing on the peace and tranquility of his surroundings to give him the strength to imagine the worst possible future for humanity. 1984 is a work of extraordinary imaginative power, a book that has entered our collective consciousness and shaped our understanding of the modern world. Its concepts, Big Brother, the Thought Police, Newspeak, the Memory Hole, Doublethink, have become part of our everyday language, a testament to the book's enduring power and relevance. It is a book that was born of Orwell's own experiences, his time in the colonial police, his disillusionment with communism in Spain, his work as a propagandist at the BBC. But it is also a work of prophetic vision, a book that foresaw the direction that modern society was taking. The novel tells the story of Winston Smith, a low-ranking member of the ruling party in the totalitarian state of Oceania. Winston works at the Ministry of Truth, where his job is to rewrite history to conform to the party's current version of reality. He lives in a world where every aspect of life is controlled by the state, where privacy is impossible, and where even thoughts are monitored by the thought police. Winston's rebellion against the system begins with his decision to keep a diary, a simple act that is punishable by death. His rebellion deepens when he begins an affair with Julia, a young woman who works in the Ministry of Truth together. They try to find ways to resist the party's control, but their efforts are ultimately futile. They are betrayed, arrested, and subjected to torture and brainwashing until they are completely broken and transformed into loyal servants of the state. The novel is both a political satire and a psychological study, a book that explores the ways in which totalitarian regimes control not just the bodies but the minds of their subjects. The party's slogan, "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength," encapsulates the way in which totalitarian regimes use language to confuse and manipulate their subjects. The concept of doublethink, the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously, shows how people can be trained to accept even the most absurd and contradictory ideas. The writing of 1984 took a terrible toll on Orwell's health. He wrote in a fever of creative energy, often working when he was seriously ill, pushing himself to the limits of his physical and mental endurance. The book was written in two main periods. The first draft was completed in 1947, and the final version was finished in 1948. The title was originally The Last Man in Europe, but Orwell changed it to 1984, simply by reversing the last two digits of the year in which he was writing. The physical act of writing was becoming increasingly difficult for Orwell. His tuberculosis was advancing, and he was often too weak to sit at his typewriter for long periods. He was forced to write much of the book in bed, propped up on pillows, with the typewriter balanced on his knees. The effort was exhausting, but he was driven by a sense of urgency, a feeling that he was running out of time to deliver his warning to the world. By the time the book was finished in 1948, Orwell was a broken man, his body ravaged by disease. He was admitted to a sanatorium in the Cotswolds, where he would spend most of the remaining months of his life. The doctors told him that his only hope was complete rest, but Orwell found it impossible to stop working. He continued to write articles and reviews, and he began planning his next book, a novel about the atomic bomb. It was during this final illness that he met and married Sonia Brownell. She was a beautiful and intelligent young woman who worked at the literary magazine Horizon, where she was an assistant to the editor Cyril Connolly. She was 29 years old, 17 years younger than Orwell, and she moved in the fashionable literary circles of London. She was a friend of many of Orwell's friends, including Arthur Koestler and Stephen Spender, and she had long admired his work. Their relationship began as a friendship, based on mutual respect and shared literary interests. Sonia was one of the few people who was allowed to visit Orwell in the sanatorium, and she became a regular correspondent, typing his letters and helping him with his work. Gradually, their friendship deepened into something more intimate, and in the summer of 1949, Orwell proposed to her. Their marriage, which took place in his hospital room on October 13th, 1949, was a source of controversy and speculation. Some saw it as a deathbed romance, a final grasp at happiness for a dying man. Others saw it as a more calculated arrangement, a way for Sonia to secure her position as the guardian of his literary legacy. The truth, as always, was probably more complex. What is certain is that Sonia brought a measure of comfort and companionship to Orwell's final months. She was an intelligent and cultured woman who understood his work and shared his literary values. She also had the practical skills and social connections that could help to secure his reputation after his death. For Orwell, who had been lonely and isolated since Eileen's death, the marriage represented a return to the kind of intellectual partnership that had sustained him throughout his career. 1984 was published in June 1949, just 7 months before Orwell's death. It was an immediate and sensational success, in a book that captured the anxieties of the Cold War era and gave voice to the fears of a generation. The book was praised by critics and became a bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic. It was also banned in the Soviet Union and other communist countries, a testament to its power as a political weapon. The success of the book was both gratifying and exhausting for Orwell. He was inundated with letters from readers, requests for interviews, and invitations to speak. But he was too ill to enjoy his triumph, and he was increasingly worried about the way the book was being interpreted. He was particularly concerned that it was being used as propaganda in the Cold War, when his intention had been to warn against totalitarianism in all its forms, not just the communist variety. The prophet's vision was complete, his final warning delivered. The man who had given the world its most terrifying vision of the future had no future of his own. But in his final months, as he lay dying in a London hospital, he could take comfort in the knowledge that his work would outlive him, that his voice would continue to speak truth to power long after he was gone. George Orwell spent the last months of his life in University College Hospital, London, in a private room that had been paid for by the royalties from his books. He was a famous man now, the author of 2 of the most important books of his time, but he was also a dying man, his body slowly succumbing to the tuberculosis that had been his lifelong companion. The treatments of the time were crude and often ineffective, and there was little that the doctors could do for him except try to make him comfortable and hope for a miracle that never came. He faced his approaching death with the same courage and honesty that had characterized his life, a man who was determined to look the truth in the face, no matter how grim it might be. He continued to work almost until the end, dictating letters and articles to his wife Sonia, who had become his constant companion and nurse. He was planning new books, including a novel about the atomic bomb and a collection of essays about his experiences as a writer. He was a man who was alive to the very end, a man whose mind remained sharp and clear even as his body failed him. His hospital room became a kind of literary salon, a place where friends and admirers came to pay their respects. Among his visitors were Arthur Koestler, the author of Darkness at Noon, who had become a close friend and intellectual companion; Malcolm Muggeridge, the journalist and satirist who shared Orwell's skepticism about political orthodoxies; and Anthony Powell, the novelist who would later write a 12-volume sequence about English social life. They came to talk about books and politics, to argue about the future of socialism, and to say goodbye to a man they recognized as one of the most important writers of their generation. Orwell was particularly concerned about the interpretation of 1984 and the way it was being used as a weapon in the Cold War. He had intended the book as a warning against totalitarianism in all its forms, not as a piece of anti-communist propaganda. He was worried that the book was being misunderstood, that people were seeing it as a prediction of the inevitable future rather than as a warning about what might happen if certain trends continued unchecked. In one of his last interviews, given to a journalist from the New York Times, he emphasized that 1984 was not a prophecy but a warning. "I do not believe," he said, "that the kind of society I describe necessarily will arrive, but I believe that something resembling it could arrive. I believe also that totalitarian ideas have taken root in the minds of intellectuals everywhere, and I have tried to draw these ideas to their logical conclusions." He was also concerned about his literary legacy and the future of his work. He had appointed Sonia as his literary executor, and he spent many hours discussing with her the publication of his collected works and the preservation of his manuscripts. He was particularly anxious that his early work should not be republished without careful editing, as he felt that much of it was inferior and might damage his reputation. Despite his illness, Orwell remained engaged with the political and intellectual debates of the day. He was following the progress of the Cold War with keen interest, and he was particularly concerned about the situation in Eastern Europe, where the Soviet Union was imposing communist governments on the countries it had liberated from Nazi rule. He saw this as confirmation of his warnings about the nature of Stalinism, but he was also worried that the Western response was becoming too militaristic and aggressive. He was also thinking about the future of socialism and the lessons that could be learned from the failures of the past. He believed that socialism was still possible, but only if it could be freed from the dogmatism and authoritarianism that had characterized the communist movement. He envisioned a democratic socialism that would preserve individual liberty while promoting social justice. A socialism that would be rooted in the traditions and values of each particular country, rather than imposed from above by a revolutionary vanguard. On the evening of January 20th, 1950, Orwell was visited by his friend and publisher, Frederick Warburg. They talked about his plans for the future, about the books he still wanted to write, about his hopes for his son Richard, who was now 5 years old. Warburg later recalled that Orwell seemed in good spirits despite his obvious physical weakness. They discussed the possibility of Orwell traveling to Switzerland for treatment at a sanatorium that specialized in tuberculosis, and Orwell expressed cautious optimism about his chances of recovery. But later that night, alone in his hospital room, an artery in Orwell's lung burst, causing a massive hemorrhage. He died in his sleep, without pain or struggle, at the age of 46. The nurse who found him the next morning said that he looked peaceful, as if he had simply fallen asleep and chosen not to wake up. The news of Orwell's death was front-page news in newspapers around the world. Obituaries praised him as one of the most important writers of his generation, a man who had used his pen as a weapon in the fight against tyranny and injustice. The Times of London called him a writer of extraordinary honesty and courage, while the New York Times described him as the conscience of his generation. His funeral was a small, private affair, held at Christ Church in Albany Street, London, on January 26, 1950. The service was attended by about 30 people, including his wife Sonia, his sister Avril, his son Richard, and a small group of close friends. The service was simple and dignified, reflecting Orwell's own preferences for simplicity and honesty over pomp and ceremony. He was buried in the churchyard of All Saints' Church in Sutton Courtenay, a small village in Oxfordshire. The grave is marked by a simple stone that bears only his real name, Eric Arthur Blair, and the dates of his birth and death. There is no mention of George Orwell, no reference to his books or his achievements. It was a final act of modesty from a man who had always been suspicious of fame and celebrity. But Orwell's death was not an end. It was a beginning. In the years since his death, his reputation has grown to almost mythical proportions. He has become more than a writer. He has become a symbol, a touchstone, a moral compass. His work has been translated into dozens of languages. His books have sold millions of copies, and his ideas have become part of the very fabric of our political culture. The adjective Orwellian has entered the language, a shorthand for the nightmarish world of totalitarian control that he so brilliantly and terrifyingly described. His concepts, Big Brother, doublethink, thought crime, the memory hole, have become part of our everyday vocabulary, tools for understanding and critiquing the abuses of power in our own time. In the end, the transformation was complete. The boy who was born Eric Blair, the product of the English class system and the British Empire, had become George Orwell, the conscience of his generation, the man who diagnosed the diseases of the modern age with such terrifying clarity. His life was a journey from the heart of the empire to the margins of society, a journey from complicity to rebellion, a journey from the man he was born to be to the man he chose to become. It was a journey that was cut short by illness and tragedy, but it was a journey that produced some of the most important and enduring literature of the 20th century. Eric Blair is dead, but George Orwell lives on. More than 70 years after his lonely death in a London hospital, George Orwell is more alive than ever, his voice still speaking truth to power, his vision still warning us about the dangers that threaten our freedom and our humanity. The conscience of his generation has become the conscience of all generations, a voice that will continue to speak as long as there are people who value truth over lies, freedom over tyranny, and the dignity of the individual over the power of the state.